Welcome back to Black History Year, where we celebrate Black culture and question everything they taught us in school. If you're ready for the real history, hit like and subscribe. Now, let's get it.
So the way that we like to open up all our episodes here at Black History Year, we like to ask the same question to each guest. And today we got a little bit of a remix on it for you. But essentially, William, we want to know if you had to summarize Black liberation in a single word or phrase, what would it be?
When it comes to that word liberation, I tend to actually stray away from describing it. So if I had to describe liberation in one word, it would be indescribable.
Ooh.
And the reason that I talk about liberation and Black liberation that way now, it's been an evolution and a growth process for me to get to this point of thinking of it in that way. And the reason that I do that is because I see liberation as something that's not stagnant. It's a constantly changing growth period, process of change and transformation that requires people to be collectively engaged in a way that demands their observation and their participation. So if you're talking about liberation, you have to be plugged in enough to see the conditions around you and have those conditions inform what is actually liberatory. A problem can arise that you didn't anticipate or that you didn't know about. And you can say, oh, well, I didn't know that this was coming. I had no idea we would have to confront this. And confronting that can be a part of getting towards something more liberatory. So since we can't see the future, and since we don't know everything that's going to be required of us to make better, more liberatory conditions, liberation itself cannot be finite. It cannot be a fixed, stagnant thing. It's a process. So I don't describe it in one word. I could say something like safety. I could say something like peace. But those are just components of liberation. Liberation itself, that's like trying to describe heaven or nirvana. It's too expansive to be contained within one word for me. So I would say it's indescribable. It's almost impossible for me to put it into one word.
Copy that. Before we put that particular framing of liberation in conversation with today's topic on the death penalty, I want to share a quote with you, William. I actually heard this yesterday from our brilliant producer, Lily. She shared a quote that she heard that said, happiness is not a direction, or happiness is not a destination, it's a direction. And from what you just shared, it reminds me of how you're thinking about liberation. It does not seem to be a finite thing, a place that we arrive at and everything's all good. It's a horizon that we're constantly chasing. So liberation as a direction, not a destination, right? We have to almost kind of improv as we go, because we can't see what the future holds for all of us, right? 300 years ago, if we asked the question around Black liberation, maybe folks wouldn't think about eco-catastrophe, but now that's right in front of us. So I love that framing. It's indescribable, but we should always be seeking and searching, having access to the information so we can be aware of what's coming down the pipeline and how we can respond to it. Yeah. Thank you so much for that rich framing of liberation, fam.
I like the way you tied that in too, thinking about like the past. Somebody who was enslaved, one of our ancestors who was enslaved, might have described liberation in a very substandard condition based on what we have now. They might have described liberation as just having a job and getting paid for it. Whereas we think of that as a condition we want to, evolve and grow from. That might have been liberation to somebody who was living in chattel slavery conditions. So, what we have now for someone in the past could have been liberation, but we know that there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely. We got a long way to go in thinking about that. Let's dive right into today's topic on the legacy of the death penalty It does seem like we have a long ways to go, and I do imagine that we have come a long way. But with that said, I'm curious, William, just at a very high level, where do we begin in terms of an origin point to think about the death penalty in the U.S.? Did we start in colonial times? Did we start during the Jim Crow era? Yeah, how might we begin this conversation historically, you think?
I think for the sake of this conversation, you could probably really start thinking from the early 1800s. I think that that's a good place to start. And the reason I named that particular era is because the framing that I would use to talk about the death penalty is one that is largely critical of reform. And when I talk about reform, I'm talking about the measures and the changes that are put in place that are supposedly there to make more humane, quote unquote, conditions for the public and for people experiencing incarceration and subjugation and other forms of state oppression. So when we're thinking about the death penalty, I would probably start there because I tend to think about that period as a really interesting one when it comes to reform. This is when the first modern prison, the Eastern, was heralded as the first modern prison, the Eastern State Penitentiary, comes forth in Philadelphia. And this facility was brought forth by the Philadelphia Prison Society, which was originally called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Prisons, of public prisons.
Wait, pause real quick.
And
So they started out trying to reform?
yes.
Okay.
So this was a society with Benjamin Franklin among its members, among its foundational members, and they're coming forth pushing for better conditions within prisons. And around this period, also, Philadelphia becomes the first state to move execution away from the public eye, and get away from this kind of spectacle of execution. And so when I use that framing of reform, I think it's just important to understand that the death penalty itself is really a reform measure in many regards.
Wow.
When we come to a point later, when we get towards the late 1800s and early 1900s, this is when you can kind of really start to think about how the death penalty is a reform of lynching, and that is the codification of lynching, because it is a transition from saying, just as I mentioned with the Philadelphia Prison Society and the reform of prison into a more organized, structured facility, so too is the death penalty transitioned into something that is much more formal and institutionalized over time. So it's actually a reform. When we think about these things that we're used to, such as prisons, policing, and the death penalty, we should think about them in the context of reform.
My goodness. There was a phrase that you lifted up, specifically this notion of a spectacle of violence. So during this time, they wanted to move executions from the public to like this private state sphere. Before we touch upon lynching, or I actually want to put lynching in the conversation here, what do you think that this notion of spectacle of violence does in relationship to the death penalty? Why was it a public affair? What were its intentions there? Any thoughts there?
Well, it depends on where you're thinking about in the country. I'm talking about the Northeast. I'm talking about a particular context, and they were trying to move away from these practices that were seen as barbaric. So with the Philadelphia Prison Society that I mentioned, they were trying to innovate and reform in this way towards having a modern prison, so that people wouldn't be put into these squalid conditions that were full of disease and germs and sexual violence and mixture of people of different ages and gender identities, people just being thrown into like, you know, a pit together essentially. And they were like, this is not good. So you had groups like the Quakers, for instance, who were pushing for something that was considered more evolved from such a barbaric and really disturbing sort of condition. So they designed this institution that lays the groundwork, not just in the United States, but for other countries, that becomes the model for the modern prison facility. And that sort of era and that sort of time with that type of reform, I think really informs my thinking about how I approach talking about a lot of different things with the criminal legal system, because reform is the foundation for it's like a containment of so much of the violence that has been normalized. It's this place where the state can say, no, this is our violence to met out and to carry out and to organize. And although there are different death penalty states that do or don't have the death penalty, I still think that reform is in a really important context to understand, even though it varies from state to state, for how this form of state violence becomes what we know it as today in many respects.
My goodness. Ooh, absolutely want to touch upon what you mentioned around the state owning this element of violence. I believe earlier you mentioned this notion of monopoly of violence in the state. Want to table that for when we get to one of our spicier subtopics. But right now, I want to sit with this notion of lynching. And I'm not quite sure what era we can substantiate the death penalty as a tool of racial control, but it absolutely seems like it is today. Would I be wrong in thinking about the Jim Crow era, or should we be looking a little bit earlier and thinking about lynching as a form of like racial control, death, a form of like actual death penalty, whether leveraged by the state or mobs?
Yeah, I mean, there's different periods, I think, that require different observations. But for me, when I'm thinking about the death penalty in this conversation and going into the early 1900s and what is called like the progressive era, you know, this is an era of a lot of reforms and a lot of things that change in terms of states determining what will or won't happen under the law and executing people. And when we get to the early 1900s, we're also thinking about a lot of other things are happening. There's a lot of other big moments happening in history. You have the Red Scare, which is, you know, a response to the increasing socialist sentiments among people who are organizing and movements that were building in response to the Russian Revolution. You have a lot of different things that are happening in terms of class, in terms of the labor movement. And I think that ultimately what I'm trying to say is that the death penalty really increases and decreases in US history based on a larger social and societal context.
Okay.
And so also during this period, when you're talking about the early 1900s, there's extreme racial violence. We can think about like the Red Summer. We can think about the resurgence of the Klan. And also about things like convict leasing. And thinking about like, this post-slavery world, after Reconstruction, entering into this period, there is a lot of transition that's happening. And it becomes, I think, a really important aspect of not just individual states, but the state itself, the United States, to figure out how society is going to be organized and are how there's going to be a way to deal with different movements, different things that are happening in a social and public context.
Yes, indeed.
So when it comes to enslavement, we know that enslavement is reformed into convict leasing, and ultimately this lays the groundwork for what we know today as mass incarceration and the modern day quote unquote slavery that takes place in the prison system.
Yes. Yes.
So when we're thinking about all of that, we have to put the death penalty and lynching in conversation there too, because as uh, lynchings go through this period of transformation, the death penalty kind of comes in and takes the place of lynching, which
Mm.
is really, really, when in my opinion, I would describe that as the death penalty being a reform of lynching.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for laying that historical groundwork for us, fam. Right
Mhm.
now, I'm thinking of a figure who's inspiring to many of us here at PushBlack. Also, I believe she's inspiring to you as well, William. But Ida B. Wells. I'm thinking about her work, her extensive work in documenting lynchings, particularly the Red Record. Could you share a bit about Ida B. Wells' legacy, in particular, and how she addressed lynchings, these mob violence incidences that she witnessed? Yes, yes. Any thoughts you want to share there?
Yeah, I mean, Ida B. Wells was amazing. She was a phenomenal journalist and advocate who was not someone who just talked about it, but she really was about it. She was on the ground. She was organizing people. She was intervening in ways that were absolutely crucial to affecting the lives and changing so much for the better when it came to a lot of the Black people who were uh, suffering in cases that she talked about, identified, who were killed, who were
Mhm.
lynched, who were incarcerated in prison, and so on and so forth. So I look up to her because she had a pen that she used like a sword. And
Ooh.
what she really exposed about lynching in particular is I think that she really did a fantastic job exposing that it was a part of a white revelry. It was exciting. It was something that was
Mm.
entertaining. She kind of exposed that it was a really bloodthirsty practice, because when you look at the legacy of lynching in connection to the criminal legal system that rules over us today, people would have you think, even back then, we don't think about it oftentimes this way because we live in this period. But back then, people were saying that lynching was justice, it was mob justice. So, this idea that this Black person, whoever it was being lynched, was considered by the mob a just act. It was like they deserved to be killed for their crime. And we know that oftentimes, particularly with Black men, that what the crime was sexual accusations of sexual violence
Mhm.
committed against white women. And Ida B. Wells talks about that. And so, with those accusations, the ultimate punishment was, we are going to lynch you. We're going to celebrate. When the camera comes along, we have lynching photos. Um, and there was a jubilant atmosphere. She documents this extensively, that there was a celebration of the fact. It was like a fair. Um, there was an excitement. around the killing. People took souvenirs. They took pieces of the body.
Mm.
Kids were there watching. It was really a grotesque event.
Yeah.
So when you understand that, you can kind of draw some connections to this idea that the death penalty, as we know it now, is necessary
Mm.
because there didn't have to be any hard evidence, or there didn't have to be any sort of process to kill someone. A lot of times, people who were lynched were actually taken from jails to be killed in that way. But what I'm trying to get to here is that we should be able to draw some connections when we listen to the language of then versus now, and how the justification is this person has committed this heinous act and they deserve to be executed. And I know that we tend to think about lynching as a different sort of circumstance because of the fact, this could be at random. This could just be, there was wasn't necessarily a judicial process. It was extrajudicial. But
Yes.
because it laid that groundwork for where we're at now, we still have to draw an important connection there and see the through lines, the way that mass incarceration primarily targets Black people,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
disproportionately targets Black people.
Yes. Yes. So many threads to latch onto here. Okay. Do want to talk about white vigilantism, because you mentioned like these extrajudicial killings, right? So white folks who deputize themselves. Let me table that for a moment, back up a couple of seconds, because there's one thing I don't want to lose sight of, particularly with regards to Ida B. Wells' legacy. So her best friend, Thomas Moss, the owner of the People's Grocery Store in Memphis, Tennessee, it seemed for that particular incident and the lynching of her close friend, Thomas Moss, which is what activated Ida to investigate these lynchings. However, there seems to be like an economic incentive, specifically in that case, but I do imagine just almost writ large. Do you see a connection between, I don't know, finance, capitalist accumulation, and the death penalty, or how the death penalty has been used against Black folks? Is there a connection there at all?
Well, it's part of the prison system, and the prison industry is an industry. So, I mean, you're talking about just one aspect of a much larger systemic money making scheme, which is this really gross, obstructive thing that we know as the prison system. We live in a prison state, a police state. These are the symptoms of the way capitalism organizes its society to exploit and to really drain communities in a number of ways. And one of those ways is by extracting people and taking them and pulling them into the prison system, where they can be exploited for a number of things like, free labor. So because of the fact that the death penalty is a part of that, we can't separate the two. We have to look at them in conversation together. And the death penalty has undergone a lot of changes, and a lot of other things have taken place since that period that we're talking about with regard to Ida B. Wells. But we know, when we look at the power of policing and the impunity with which police act, and the levels of power that they wield in society, that sort of economic incentive to dispossess Black people of land and life and property and so on and so forth, that is very much a part of what we know as policing and imprisonment today. We can see that in a number of ways and the way it plays out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to transition and talk about, for lack of a better phrase, modern day lynchings, if it's fair to frame it this way. So I'm thinking of Trayvon Martin. I'm thinking of Ahmaud Arbery. And I'm thinking about what we just mentioned, this notion of extrajudicial killings by white folks, specifically white people who will deputize themselves to act as if they're the state. Yeah, anything to share just around like white vigilantisms, thinking about Kyle Rittenhouse, Zimmerman, yeah, anything.
The white people who we talk about in terms of vigilantism that have killed Black people, like Jordan Neely, like Trayvon Martin, and many other cases, we would do well to think of them as police without badges.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is these are white people who consciously or subconsciously, and they don't always have to be white, they can just be doing something that is in the interest of white supremacy. I want to clarify that. They understand, oftentimes consciously or subconsciously, that they have been deputized and that they have the ability to take life and to get away with it in the same way that those lynch mobs did, because that's the legacy and that's the foundation. So over time, when you look at the tradition of lynching and of mob violence, the message that's sent is you can actually kill, torture, dismember, all sorts of things that are heinous. You can do all these sorts of heinous acts of violence towards Black people and get away with it, because the idea is that Black people and the Black population is inherently criminal. And there's a lot of different ways we can go with that, but when you think about a place like the US South, there's a resentment because of emancipation. There's a resentment because of Reconstruction. There's a resentment because of so many things that we can understand in the context of the post-Civil War era, that leads the white population to feel that since Black people are not properly subjugated, that they need to be terrorized, need to be killed, and they need to be subjugated in a particular way, because that is the way that life is supposed to be. That's the way white supremacy is supposed to operate. That is considered justice. That's considered proper. So going back to this point of these vigilantes, when we're thinking about them as police without badges, I'm saying that regardless of if they have the title of police officer or not, they're carrying out a type of extrajudicial violence that typically would be granted to someone who had undergone the training and the procedure and the institutional methods to be able to do that anyways. Because when we're thinking about policing and execution, police killings are public executions. We don't talk about capital punishment always in that way. But when the police see a Black person and say, this person, I think they had a gun, or I think they committed this crime, and takes it upon themselves to act as judge and jury in this moment and kill that person, that was an extrajudicial execution. They decided in that moment that they were going to put that person to death. Just because it didn't happen in an electric chair or with a lethal injection or a gas chamber doesn't mean it wasn't an execution. And it's a state-sanctioned execution still, because the state is what has empowered that police officer to act with that level of power and decision-making ability to take a life. So then when you extend that to white supremacist vigilantes, and you see the connections between different white supremacist groups today who carry out types of mob violence and targeted violence towards specific communities, they're acting as an extension of the logic, again, that lays the foundation for all this racialized anti-Black violence.
Oh, wait. Ooh, wait. Thank you. No, that was heavy, fam. But no, I appreciate you building that bridge.
It's heavy. It's heavy.
Okay. I want to transition a bit. No, fuck that. Actually, it just came back to me. I'm sorry. As you were thinking, fam, just mad more questions were bubbling up. I want to circle back.
You're good. You're good.
Yeah, thank you, man. I want to circle back to this notion of reform and place it in conversation with folks who may feel like, oh, there could be a more humane way to, I don't know, still use the death penalty. How do you respond to folks who say like, okay, maybe there's a way we could reform this to make this less inhumane, to sanitize it a bit? Yeah, any thoughts on just the evolution of just trying to make the death penalty more humane? And how do you respond to folks who may feel like, oh, no, we can actually do this in a way that preserves our own humanity? Any thoughts there?
You cannot take an institution or a tool that was specifically designed to subjugate and oppress people and make it good. Like that it does not happen. This is what so much of my work is about, is trying to explain this about different, aspects of society and institutions. You have to look at the foundation of what something was designed and what its intended purpose was. Mm-hmm. And so when it comes to execution, and when it comes to the criminal legal system in the United States, you have people who oftentimes talk about it, particularly liberal reformers, and they'll say things like, the system is broken. The system isn't working. The system is absolutely working as it was intended. It's killing who it was meant to kill. It's imprisoning who it was meant to imprison. And it's maintaining power for the people who were meant to be empowered. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's not dysfunctional. It's not broken. It's working correctly. Just because you feel like the way that it's working correctly is in excess, just because you feel like it's excessive and that it's too egregious, doesn't mean that it's malfunctioning. Yeah. It means that it is actually working to its fullest in potential and extent. It's not something that should be surprising to see this manifest as fascistic and authoritarian overreaches, because you created something that can build that sort of power and that sort of presence. So it's doing what it's intended to do.
Absolutely.
So you can't make something that was meant to kill, more nice.
Yeah. I'm sorry, fam. As you were speaking, it just made me, I definitely don't want to dive into like the devilish details of this, but the horrific examples of botched executions. Some people feel like, oh, maybe the use of these chemicals could be more humane. But then we hear stories about how torturous that is, how medieval it actually is. Yeah, that's what comes up for me when I think about folks who want to kind of reform this particular practice. It's like, all right, how do you humanely murder somebody? Like, I don't think there's a way to do that. But with that said, I do want to lean into really some of the more, I don't know, maybe I want to kind of break open this conversation a bit, William, and I want to think about your particular history as an abolitionist. And I'm curious, specifically, what initially drew you to become an abolitionist? was there a particular moment as it relates to the death penalty or a particular moment of state-sanctioned violence that kind of opened up the avenue of abolition for you?
I mean, I'm just a Black person that grew up in the South. So I had a very oppressive experience with policing, and that really showed me what policing was for, what it was about. Just experiences being racially profiled and stopped and searched and all of these things all of the time, really regularly. When you're not doing anything, it makes it really clear what the systemic purpose is of this institution.
Mm-hmm.
So I was drawn in through understanding what was happening with people who I, was in community with, my family, friends, so on and so forth. And I was drawn in by just seeing what it had done, not just in the present day, but in my family history, just looking at all of the things that had played out through the criminal legal system. And it made me say to myself that this is something that ultimately is unreformable. And maybe unreformable isn't the right word because of the context I provided earlier to explain what reform really is. It is reformable, but it's not ever going to be anything liberatory in the sense that it's not going to get us closer towards that horizon we were talking about earlier, where we're in better conditions. It's actually pulling us backwards. So that was what made me have this resolve and understanding to move towards abolitionist politic, which is perhaps a little bit diluted in some ways right now because of the way it's been kind of co-opted by a lot of people who have very liberal reformist ideas about what abolition is.
Yeah. Set the record straight. For you, what is abolition and what ain't abolition?
For me, when I'm thinking about, so let's go back to that example that you just brought up of the botched executions. And I can just kind of use that to provide some context for the way I'm thinking about this.
Mm-hmm.
But in the early 2010s, when we saw this botched execution that took place that led to pharmaceutical companies withdrawing their sales of the drugs that were being used for lethal injections to death penalty states. It led to a scramble to acquire new drugs because the states wanted to execute the people that they had on death row. And because of that, there was a lot of experimental executions with people who were not qualified, as disturbing as it is to use that word, as we're not qualified to carry out that sort of search for the replacement drugs necessarily. And they ended up killing people on death row in experimental and messed up ways, really torturous ways, with these cocktails of drugs that they were using to try to replace what they had been using for lethal injection. And that led to some moratoriums on executions because they were searching for ways to kill people and execute people with different drugs, which ultimately led to this moment that we're in now, where a lot of states have put different old methods back on the book to be able to execute the people that they have imprisoned on death row. So we're talking about the use of gassing,
Firing
Alabama,
squads?
yeah, firing squads, gassing, electric chair, even hanging,
Oh my God.
And so, with that being the case, there's been a regression again because you cannot change something away from its intended purpose. You cannot reform it away from its intended purpose. It's going to do what it's designed to do. So when it comes back to this point of abolition, for me, I tend to think about abolition in an expansive way that is tied to a radical politic that challenges the organization of society as a whole and not just focuses on institutions that carry out the roles of the criminal legal system. I'm talking about the state, I'm talking about everything. So I'm not just looking at one aspect like the death penalty or prisons or the police. I'm looking at the whole thing, because the way that we see society right now being reorganized to our detriment with the stroke of a pen through executive action from the presidency, I'm thinking about the antithesis of that, which is the reorganization of society for the better through collective organizing and struggle towards a revolutionary end.
Oh, so we're talking about mass social transformation through revolution? Is that what we're thinking about here when we think about abolition?
That's the way I think about it.
Absolutely. I love that, William. I love that. Want to take a step back to something you mentioned earlier. I've always found a kinship with you, William, as we're both from the South. And I want to think about how to make abolition more personal to us. And when I think about the South, and I hate to frame it this way because we know this way of thinking exists everywhere, but I'm thinking about the grip that a certain colonial framing of Christianity has on certain populaces. And I'm thinking about this relationship just between violence and order, because that seems like the elemental relationship when we think about the death penalty. Like, okay, you did something wrong, so now let me overcorrect it with harm to put you in alignment, right? As a form of discipline. I'm thinking about, that old distorted quote, spare the rod, spoil the child. Doesn't even really say that, but people are just taking that up. Also, I've heard quotes about we have to challenge the cops in our heads. With all that said, William, how might we break open this relationship just between violence and order, violence and discipline? I mean, as an abolitionist, do you think that's possible?
Well, I think that one of the important tasks at hand for people in the United States, there's many, there's many tasks that we need to take up. But one of the most important is to start looking at ourselves as a part of an international community and think beyond borders. And the reason that I say that is because oftentimes people in the United States do not know a lot of things that they should know about other parts of the world. And one of those things that a lot of people in the United States do not know about other parts of the world is that there are many countries that do not have the death penalty.
What? What? When you say many, is it more than not? Like what?
Many countries do not have the death penalty. And then there are countries who do have the death penalty and have not used it.
Wow.
So we have to put ourselves in the context of this world. Let's think beyond borders and not divide ourselves solely based on country, but see ourselves as a part of a world population where people who are confined within certain borders have societies that are organized in different ways. And those people who live in countries that do not have the death penalty, I'm not saying that all of their laws and their constitutions or Their founding documents are the exact same as ours here. And they're not really ours. I shouldn't even use that word. But what I will say is that regardless of the fact that these are different places with different histories and different foundations, it's worth taking into consideration looking at the way that there are places that are able to have lower crime rates, that are able to have stable and safer societies, and that do not have the death penalty implemented. And so, when it comes to the so-called Western world, particularly, you look at Europe, and Europe, just like all of Europe, has abolished the death penalty just about, right? So it's like, what is it that makes it so that other countries can manage to function without this, but in the United States, it's seen as so absolutely fundamental and necessary because it's supposed to keep society safer? It doesn't keep society safer, because if it did, I'll expand that actually.
Okay.
If prisons, policing, and the death penalty made a society safer, the US would be the safest society on the face of the earth. This is one of the top execution countries in the world. This is one of the top mass incarcerating societies in the world. And this is one of the most over-policed societies in the world. So why can't you send your kids to school and not worry about them being massacred? Why can't you go into public places and not worrying about being shot at random by somebody carrying a weapon of war? Why can't you, as a Black person, feel safe in your own neighborhood without worrying about the police just killing you just because they want to? Why can't you and your family feel good about traveling to certain parts of the country without having to worry about if you're going to be attacked or threatened because of your race? If this society, the way that it's designed and the way that we live in it, was going to be safe because of these institutions, policing, prisons, and the death penalty, then why is this society not perfect? The United States has these things to such extreme measures that it should be absolutely the safest, most secure place to have a family and to be at peace. Yet you look at other countries that do not have anywhere near the resources, anywhere near the amount of policing, anywhere near the amount of guns, and they are living in much more safe conditions than people here in the United States. So we have to see ourselves in that international community and get out of this mindset that we live in this amazing, perfect, flawless country where we have the privilege of being a so-called American and we have the best this and the best that. All of that is what we call propaganda. We've been fed propaganda about the place that we live, and we have to work to undo that propaganda through political education and growth and seeing ourselves as a part of the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love how that pairs so well with your framing of just liberation writ large. Right now, I'm thinking about this notion of social transformation that we touched upon as it relates to abolition. But there's also a very interesting and core piece of your background that I would love for us to touch upon in relationship to the death penalty and carcerality, and that's Black anarchism. You know, earlier we mentioned like the state monopoly on violence. I'm curious, from your perspective, what does Black anarchism kind of bring to this conversation? Does it have the potential to kind of break open this state monopoly on violence? And yeah, what is like the anarchism approach, if we could even say there's not one, but just anarchism, a Black anarchism philosophy? How might that lead to different possibilities when trying to abolish the death penalty?
So I hope that you and I can have another conversation about anarchism, because this is a whole other segment. But just to give a little bit of context and history for people who might not know what we mean when we say Black anarchism. I'm an author. My most recent book is The Nation on No Map. I also co-authored a book called As Black as Resistance, and both of them deal with anarchism and Black anarchist history particularly. The latter, the latter is, as in terms of those writings, As Black as Resistance is much more of a manifesto type work, and The Nation on No Map, my most recent book, is much more focused on kind of expanding on the place that I was coming from when I was working on As Black as Resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so that expansion is really me trying to bring this into an abolitionist conversation, this part of the Black radical tradition that's been extremely overlooked.
Mm.
And when we think about the Black radical tradition and the icons and thinkers and struggle that really shapes its contours and really makes it what it is, we oftentimes have failed miserably at looking at certain aspects of that history because of ideology,
Mm-hmm.
because of sectarianism,
Propaganda.
and because of our attachment to great figures. So oftentimes we look over the rank and file people who really make movements move. And so a big portion of my work and what I do in the world is to try to excavate and bring attention to not just those rank and file thinkers, revolutionaries, scholars, and activists, but also the traditions and struggles and tendencies that they carved out for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Black anarchism is. It is a breakaway movement that looks at the shortcomings of the civil rights movement, the Black Power era, and so on.
Word.
And you had a cohort of people who started to embrace a different approach to revolutionary and radical thought, which was anarchism. And it's helpful here to just briefly explain that anarchism is commonly misunderstood as a chaotic impulse and a desire to just commit acts of terror and have no government. But anarchism comes out of the socialist movement and was a part of the socialist movement of Europe that wanted to have socialism without the state.
Mm.
Whereas some people wanted to organize society through the state, there was a group of people who said, if we do that, the state is going to become a threatening, authoritarian, oppressive structure that, even though it may be controlled by some people we thought were our friends, it can still become oppressive. So we should try to build a society that doesn't rely on this monopoly on violence and try to organize ourselves in collective and federated ways that are not too structured around this really oppressive instrument that we know as the state.
Mm.
And just to also say here, keep in mind, everybody agreed that the state more or less was a problem for the most part.
Word.
It was just some people said we need to control it to bring about our liberation. And some people said we need to get rid of it and try to just build from the bottom up. I'm a person who believes in building from the bottom up, from below. And I'm highlighting the Black anarchists, the folks like Martin Sostre, like Lorenzo Kamboa Irvin, Ashanti Alston, Kwesi Balagoon, Janina Irvin, and a number of others who may not have identified themselves as anarchists, but had thought that could be associated or in line with that sort of politic. Those are the people who I draw from and want to bring more attention to for the sake of building more awareness around this part of Black history, our history, but not just to fortify some sort of new dogma and some sort of new doctrine. I try not to get too attached to ideology because I think ideology warps people's perception. With that being said, based on Black anarchism, what I do understand for myself is that when it comes to confronting the death penalty and prisons and policing and white supremacy and capitalism, I think that it is absolutely crucial for us to look at that history, because a significant people that shaped this recent, more recent in terms of the broader history of anarchism, but this more recent Black anarchist history in the civil rights movement in the Black Power era were political prisoners.
Wow.
So they had very intimate experiences with the criminal legal system because they were former Panthers who were sentenced to prison time. They were former members of the Black Liberation Army who were in prison. And because of their experiences, they came to understand that system from the inside out. And one of those people who I mentioned, Martin Sostre, was a man who was a political prisoner who reformed the entire prison system through a series of lawsuits as a jailhouse lawyer and changed conditions for people inside almost single-handedly. So there's a number of things that can be talked about there. But when we look at that history, I think what it does is it gives us a lot of context and a lot of tools to be able to understand why these things are taking place so that we can begin to deconstruct them and take them apart as things that impair our vision of what society could be and also obstruct our path towards what we want it to be. So looking at Black anarchism has given me a lot of history to provide context for how I talk about these things, how I think about these things. And one thing that Martin Sostre said that I'll quote is, he said that, the prison is, as we know it, is the facility is maximum security, but he said society as a whole was a minimum security prison. And one of the things that I really want to say for this conversation is that when you're looking at the prison system, when you're looking at the death penalty, when you're looking at what goes on with policing, we have to understand that what Sostre was pointing us towards there was an understanding that what you allow to happen in prisons, what you allow to happen with the death penalty, what you allow to happen with policing is going to come back onto you. It's going to come back onto you. So in this current moment where everybody is very shaken and disturbed by a lot of the things that are happening at the presidential level, you have to understand that stuff has been going on in prisons for a long time. And because you live in a society where you have this common sentiment that, oh, those people in there deserve that. Yeah. You create a condition where it's not contained in the prison. It's going to leak out. That's what Sostre was saying. It's going to come out. You allow those people, to be subjected to sexual violence, censorship, the stifling and the suppression of their ideas, to torture, to confinement, to the removal of paths towards education, to be limited in all the most extreme ways. You can't contain that in prison walls. It's going to come outside of those prison walls. And that's what's happening right now. It's coming out of the prison walls and we're all getting it.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for laying it out, William. Just got a couple of more questions for you, but you did reference just this current moment that we're in. Um, Man, I don't even know how to get into it, to be real with you. Donald Trump's back in office. Do you see an intentional resurgence or intensification of federal executions? What words do you have to share with us about how we might navigate this particular moment? Yeah,
Well, the first and foremost thing is always education.
copy.
So get educated on what Trump said before and what he said now. So, pardon me. When we're thinking about Donald Trump's previous term, he did a lot and said a lot with regard to execution. The things that Trump said before regarding I keep getting ready to say education. The things that Trump said before regarding execution really laid the groundwork for where he's at now. And that's kind of what you have to understand about his first term and his second term. It's like the first term was kind of more of like a trial run. Like, what can I do in here? Who's with me? And he's kind of come back into office in a way that's much more assertive because he knows kind of like how he wants to get down now. And so that's what led to a lot of the scramble around the federal death penalty at the end of the Biden term, with him taking a lot of people off of death row, and in terms of preparations for anticipating at least what Trump was saying he was going to do when he got into office, which was similar to what he did at the end of his last term, which he had a killing spree at the end of his last term. Donald Trump executed more people than several presidents before him combined.
Wow.
So during the end of his last term, he scrambled to kill as many people as he could. There's some reporting in ProPublica that you can read about, people being strapped to the gurney while they wait to see if the court's going to be able to tell them if they can kill him. And it's just like, as soon as they get the approval, it's over. So also the federal execution methods were expanded, with Trump and with Bill Barr, in the way that, there was so much put on the table in terms of like, can we gas people? Can we hang them? Can we put them in front of a firing squad? What can we do in terms of how we have standards for the methods that we can use at the federal level as opposed to the state level?
Yes, indeed.
Where the states are, again, as I mentioned earlier, also expanding their different methods for execution. So looking at where we're at now, it is important to just be aware of what's been said. Donald Trump has floated televised executions. I've read reporting about him saying that even whistleblowers, I think, could be possibly subjected to execution. So you're talking about a really draconian dictatorial use of death penalty power. And this brings us back to that reform conversation, because where you have some people who might have like a liberal set of politics and look at this and say, well, this is overreach. You can't do that. This is against the rules. This is too much. Then you can't have it at all. Yeah. You have to abolish it, because if it's there, you're putting it in the position to be used in this way. And you cannot reform and think that this is going to just stay safe in the right hands. Well, here it is in what people will say is the wrong hands, based on their politics, and that tells you what the implications are of having such a thing exist in society at all.
Absolutely.
So in order to resist it, I don't want to just be pessimistic and negative about it. In order to resist it, I think it's going to be absolutely necessary for people to get involved with and build movements and struggle against the larger criminal legal system as a whole, not just the death penalty, but prisons and policing. And people are going to have to go way back left on this because this should have been happening for a long time. There has to be a movement against the egregious monster that is the criminal legal system, the so-called justice system in the US. This is one of the most dangerous threats to Black life in this country that we can possibly think of. And we absolutely fundamentally have to work against it if we plan on not ever having any experiences and fear and threats to us like what we're under now.
Absolutely. Absolutely, William. I just got 2 questions for you, and they engage a bit of speculation. I appreciate you highlighting just the methods and modes of resistance that we should be thinking about. But just to kind of switch gears for a bit, yeah, I'm curious, William, thinking about your response to how you might understand liberation. You mentioned indescribable. I'm curious, what comes up for you when you imagine a world without the death penalty, a world without carcerality? What does that look like for you? What does that feel like? Yeah. Any imaginative details? Go to the moon with it.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about, honestly, I mean, I hate to be boring, but when I think about those things, when I think about a world without the levels of carcerality and oppression and subjugation that we experience at the hands of the criminal legal system, like I said, I don't want to be boring, but I do think that, again, it requires me to look at the rest of the world. I tend to look around at other countries. I've been to other countries. I've traveled enough at this point to talk to people and have them look at me with such shock and awe when I tell them about the legal system in the US, because they're just like, oh, there's nothing like that here. That's horrible. Why do you have that type of sentencing? Why do you have the death penalty? Why do you have police that can do that? So it's, when you think about and imagine what is possible, sometimes you just need not do much but look, to a place that's maybe right across the ocean or a country to the south or to the east or wherever the case may be, and say to yourself, what are they doing?
Mm-hmm.
What could we do that's even better than that?
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you for reframing that, because originally I was thinking in like this futuristic context and whatnot, but these spaces absolutely exist here today. We just need to look beyond our borders. Oh my God. Thank you so much.
Because that's part of what our work is to see the limitations of where we live and where other people live based on what they're fighting and what they're struggling against. And like I said, just try to be better than both.
Mm-hmm.
It's way easy. It's way easy to be better than the US, because the US, we're decades and decades and decades behind. We don't even have healthcare here. Like, we have crumbling infrastructure. With so many of the developments that have been happening around a lot of the issues relating to social media and censorship, so many folks have been starting to understand that countries like China and other places around the world are not what we have been told in this country. And, some people know those things because they're traveling and they see these things. That's how I've learned, is through traveling and making friends and connections, comrades, and having new experiences. But once you understand that there's a lot of places and people around the world who do things much, 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 much better than the US, it brings it back to earth from feeling like this is something that we have to find in another galaxy, in another future, into a reality where we understand that this is very much something that's within grasp. We just have really, really terrible people in power in this country who prevent us from having the most basic resources and needs met.
My goodness. My goodness. Thank you so much, William. Last question. We're going to get on up out of here. It's a bit of speculation. It's going to take us in a little bit of a different direction. Let's imagine that we have our own space. It's not a state. It's not a nation. Let's just call it Liberation Island. And you are invited to Liberation Island. Everyone's invited, William. But if you could only bring one film or an album or one book, what would you bring to Liberation Island to contribute to the liberatory library?
Oh man. You're telling me I get one film, one book, and one album, or just one of those?
I was going to just say one of them, but if you got one for each category, would love for you to share.
You know, that's like the worst question you've asked me so far, because it's like that's so hard. Listen, I'll keep it 100 with you. If I was gonna probably bring one book, it would probably be A Map to the Door of No Return by Dion Brand. So that would probably be the one book I bring to Liberation Island. I think that is a book that helps me think about a lot of possibility by talking about a lot of what's going on, a lot of what's wrong, a lot of what could be, you know. And yeah, the music thing, that's really hard to, you know, I would probably oftentimes go with music, but that's so hard. So we can, for now, just stick with Maps to the Door, No Return by Dion Brand.
Thank you so much, William. We absolutely got to have you back on to dive deep into some Black anarchism. We appreciate you breaking open how we think about carcerality, death penalty, and then also the possibilities that exist today if only we just look beyond our shores. So I can't thank you enough, fam. It's always a pleasure. Can't wait to have you back on.